Good morning. So, brethren, good morning to you. And good evening to you from wherever you are tuning in and joining us. This is brunch time with Maiyegun, with not any kind of singing at the start. So we have some of our usual reading on Maiyegun's diary, Political Brunch Time, that we shall continue today. So if you have a chance of tuning in this morning or afternoon, depends on the time you are, please share this broadcast to invite your friends, your not so friendly friends, as usual, and listen to this like you are listening to a podcast where you can still kind of like do what you are doing this morning, like you can go about your normal chores, this morning. So we are back to our reading session, and this brunch time, we shall start with the Aros Smith story. The Aros Smith story, right? A squalid end to empire, British retreat from Africa. So if you have a copy of this, of course, you can read along if you can. And if you don't, you can just listen. So for the next 90 minutes to 120 minutes, I shall be going through the page by page of this book. So thank you so much for joining me, if you are. So the foreword. To follow in Jesus' footsteps and pay the ultimate price for his faith, there was a man. So then the British values. There is a primary school in Manchester, in the north of England, whose website at the time of writing contains the following pledge. We will actively challenge children, staff, or parents expressing opinions contrary to fundamental British values. The school in question is Barlow Hall School. It is the primary school that Aros Smith attended. Barlow Hall School's commitment is mirrored in the Department of Education's own mission statement to create and enforce a clear and rigorous expectation on all schools to promote the fundamental British values of democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty. One may then wonder why it is that this dramatic story of the lone stand of the kid from Barlow Hall School to uphold the flag of fundamental British values of democracy is only now being published more than 20 years after he wrote it, 10 years after his death in 2011, and 60 years after the momentous event which he narrates. The explanation he offers in this memo is that in Britain, the establishment regards the public, the taxpayers who pay their salaries, as the enemy who must not be allowed access to secrets, for the simple reasons that if they knew what was going on, they would put a stop to it. It emerged from a BBC Radio 4 broadcast on 30th July 2007, Rigging Nigeria, in which it was interviewed that there are two top secret files relating to the period with which this book is concerned, which the British government has classified to remain closed for 100 years, and which are, therefore, not due for release for public viewing until 2060. The setting for this story is the prestigious University of Oxford, famed to be the oldest university in the English-speaking world, which traces its origins back to as early as 1096, and the British colony Nigeria, which was formed in 1900 by the Sons of Oxford. In the former setting, Aros Smith mastered the theory of democracy with an honors degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from Magdalen College, In the latter location, he saw the very antithesis of democracy in action. The consequences of the events that Aros Smith bore witness to cannot be properly quantified in terms of lives, life opportunities, and the livelihood of generations of Nigerians born and still to be born. There were also grave consequences for Aros Smith and his wife, Carol. I found myself permanently retired at 33 with no salary or pension. I had only graduated at Oxford 6 years earlier. About Nigeria. In 1900, the British created two Nigerias, Northern Nigeria and the Southern Nigeria. The former was predominantly Muslim, while the latter was almost wholly Christian. The former was resource challenged, while the other was resource rich. The plan from the outset had been to make the two Nigerias into one Nigeria. That plan was implemented at the policy level in 1912 by the appointment of Lord Frederick Lugard as Governor General of the two territories. This was followed by an edict of King George V, sealed at Windsor Castle on 22nd November 1913, which proclaimed the amalgamation with effect from the 1st January 1914. However, it was one thing for the British to treat the two countries they had created as one. It was quite another thing for the two to relate to each other as one, and even more difficult for the 371 ethnic groups with as many different languages who had been caught up in this empire building exercise. While the British remained as colonial rulers, the challenge was manageable. But as independence loomed in the wake of the American government's insistence as part of the new post-Second World War order on decolonization, the British began to make plans for the custody of the Nigerian house, which they had built. The central plot. So the central plot in the Aros Smith story is captured by the following words in Smith's introduction. What I now reveal in the following chapters is that the British government interfered with the elections so as to achieve northern domination of Nigeria. It's a charge that is strongly contested by some former British colonial officers. John Hilary Smith, who was Deputy Secretary to Nigeria's first Prime Minister, Tafawa Balewa, until just before the military coup of January 15, 1966, in which Balewa was killed and was in Nigeria in the 10 years leading up to independence, up until the end in 1970 of the Nigeria-Biafra War, which ensued, is one such. Writing to me on 24th August 2007, following the BBC radio broadcast mentioned above, he had this to say: Dr. Martin Lin's introduction to the BDEEP, British Documents at the End of Empire, volume Nigeria, and the selection of papers published in it make clear what was no secret at the time, that the Colonial Office took the view that an NPC, Northern People's Congress, led government for an independence Nigeria was in the best interest of Britain. At root, the concern was that if the NPC were excluded from government, this would prompt separatist tendencies. That does not mean that those of us in the field sought to achieve that result by corrupt means. To be set against this is evidence from another letter sent to me on June 1st, 1999, from a higher level. The letter was from Sir Peter Smithers, who had been parliamentary private secretary to the Secretary of State for the colonies through almost the whole of the period of decolonization. He was one of the three-man mission which visited Africa in 1952 to consider the federal structures which it was proposed to establish in Africa, and was present at most of the negotiations for independence, including that of Nigeria. He had also been the Secretary General to the Council of Europe from 1964 to 1969. His other claim to fame, according to his obituary, was to have been a colleague of Ian Fleming in MI6 and to have been part part model for Fleming's James Bond character. He had this to say: at the end of the war, the world had changed, and it was recognized in the colonial office that Britain had neither the means nor, more importantly, any interest in continuing to govern peoples who had arrived at a stage where they were capable of governing themselves. There was no logical foundation or political or ethical justification for a continuation of empire. There was, therefore, a clear concept of withdrawal, and the only question arising concerned the structures which should be left behind and the speed of the process. This depended greatly upon differing conditions in differing African society and was, not surprisingly, a matter of controversy within individual colonies. The attraction of the Kano rulers was that they had long and successful experience. Take that again. The attraction of the Kano ruler was that they had long and successful experience of governments. They therefore offered an obvious choice to head the new experiment. The full story of this sordid episode will, perhaps, only become clear to those who are alive when those two top secret files are opened in 2060. Until then, the public must make do with the Aros Smith story. Dele Ogun, who wrote the foreword to this book. Now, the introduction. A squalid end to empire, British retreat from Africa. This is the story of evil committed by kind, nice, decent British politicians. They sought to keep Britain from bankruptcy and found a solution in the mineral-rich empire on the point of independence. It was necessary to bend the rules, and sadly, in due course, the rules were totally forgotten. Those who got in the way were innocent like the colonial peoples, but both had to be dealt with quite harshly. They also apparently believed that to leave friends in charge of Nigeria in our absence was surely prudent, that local people would choose hot-head politicians and it was our duty to outwit them, that the loss of one or two lives is all we can truly comprehend. An expedient Whitehall decision is calm and deliberate, and the risks, if ever considered, must be small and, of course, anonymous. William was our cook and our steward during our second tour in Lagos. It was said that he had the first television set in Africa, and when William saw a lady newsreader on the TV, he tried to cover his near bare body and asked in a very frightened tone, "Can she see we?" Millions died in the great Nazi onslaught on Russia. Millions died in concentration camps. Yet we need the diary of Anne Frank to experience this tremendous loss. It is a failure of our imagination. The larger the number, the less we feel. With a question mark. Remember, in the Biafran War that started in 1966, between 2 and 3 million people died. Grace and William worked for us, and we trusted them and treated them as friends. We loved them. We left Africa and were very worried for them. Nigeria was on the brink of freedom and independence. They believed it because they trusted the British. They were Commonwealth citizens, and our coin was their coin. We know that their trust was misplaced. The British had betrayed them. In his private office in Government House on the Marina, facing the lagoon in Lagos, the Governor General, Sir James Robertson, was extremely angry. He had ordered that a senior British member of his headquarters staff be carpeted. The Governor General's personal orders had been disobeyed. Worse, the offending officer had suggested that the orders were criminal. Even when allowed to return to the UK without punishment, this young officer had persisted in his disobedience and had been returned to the colony in disgrace. I was that young officer, and I was in deep trouble. I carefully prepared for that interview and wore a freshly laundered linen suit. And although it was steaming hot, a white shirt fully buttoned up and a tie, I hoped to be told that a terrible mistake had been made. I hoped to be allowed to leave the colonial service and forget all about this ghastly experience. My hopes were to be shattered. Sir James was not in a forgiving mood. John Bongard, his private secretary, showed me into Sir James's room. Quote, "Mr. Aros Smith is here to see you, sir, as you ordered," he said, and retired. "You know why you are here, Smith?" said Sir James. "And I want you to know that all your worst fears and suspicions are absolutely correct. All the accusations you have made are correct. I'm telling you this because I want you to know how much trouble you are in. It's a cliche to say that my heart sank, but I use it deliberately because it was somewhere in my groin. I had wanted to be proved wrong, but I was being told from the highest possible source that my conclusions were correct. Britain had calmly, coldly, and with deliberation set out to destroy democracy in Nigeria, Britain's giant colony of many nations in Africa. While I was observing this incredible disclosure, Sir James was pronouncing a death sentence. In his opinion, I was willfully disobeying orders on active service. The penalty was death. If the sentence was to be postponed, and he clearly deeply regretted that, I would now do exactly as I was told. I had no choice. I listened to Sir James's terms, and when he had finished, I said nothing. I looked at the portly figure of the most senior, the most powerful representative of the Queen in the empire, and very calmly pronounced two words: "No, sir." I had graduated from Magdalen College, Oxford in 1954 and joined headquarters staff in Lagos in 1955. My career was going well. I had brilliant reports. My name was soon known in the distant part of the empire that was Nigeria. When I encountered a famous top administrator, a more famous Smith, he knew who I was. A lawmaker in Lagos who was turning the colony into a nation with laws to match. Was Smith the lawmaker? To be distinguished from Elephant Smith in the north and Tiger Smith, who had named me Smith the lawmaker when we arrived in Lagos in 1955. So chapter 1, this is the beginning of the reading. I am going to take a short break because I left my eating on overnight, so I'm beginning to feel like a slight headache. So I'll be back in a minute or two, okay? Just a minute, rather. I want to keep the windows open. One moment. Thank you. Right. Again, as we normally do on Maiyegun's diary Politico, I am going to kind of like keep the rhythm of the reading like a moderate, okay? But if for any reason you think I'm going too fast, say it, all right? And once in a while as well, I'm going to stop just to give some explanation. Now, you see, this book is to tell us how, more like to remind us historically, how the British intentionally, okay, have to put the northern Nigeria above the southern Nigeria with so many fraudulent lies, manipulations, including using fake population results. You know, that is, they call it census. The idea of having the northern Nigeria more populated than the southern part of Nigeria, was a British creation in order for them to share power, a power that can put them above the rest of us. None of them is real. And this book is there to remind us, including the role that the British played in keeping Nigeria together, siding with Nigeria during the genocidal war called the Biafran War at the time, Nigerian Biafra War, all right? So in detail, there are others within the colonial setting that are not comfortable with the arrangement. So one of them is Aros Smith, all right? And they believe that there is actually a document that pertains to, which is a secret document that pertains to this fraudulent, corrupt contraption called Nigeria, a British creation, right? And they said that this document must not be revealed until 1960, when we get to, until 2060, rather, 2060. So it's going to be like for 100 years or so. So yeah, sit back, enjoy the reading, okay? And yeah, like I said, listen to this like you are listening to a podcast. You can be doing other things just while I read, all right? And please share the broadcast as well. It's important, okay? So thank you so much. Let's move it. So chapter 1, a disorderly retreat. The British retreated from West Africa almost in a state of panic. A few African nationalists were making noisy demands for freedom from the colonial yoke, but the riots and rebellions hardly existed and no blood was shed in Nigeria, expelling the forces of imperialism. See, Nigeria never fought for independence. I hope you know that. Nigeria didn't fight for any independence. That is why we are not really independent. It was the idea of the Americans that colonization, that decolonization of Africa was to follow the World War II. And if you remember, it was the Americans, Russians, the USSR that saved Europe from Hitler. So half of, if not like 2/3 of Europe was already destroyed by the German forces until the American came to save them. So part of the agreement after that war was the decolonization of Africa. While some other African countries were already fighting the British, French for their freedom. I'm talking about rioting, protests, and so many other mutiny and all that. Nigeria didn't fight for it at all. It was the British that came together, put together an arranged independence that you have today. And that is why we do not have that nature of fighting. You can't see it in us fighting for anything. We usually probably just pray. We pray that maybe God will touch the hearts of our oppressor and they can just do right by us. So we do not have spirit of fighting for anything. Our forebearers didn't fight for anything. And that is more reason why you have this type of contraction that you have in Nigeria today. The spirit of docility, the spirit of slavery, the spirit of submission to the will of God. God will do it. Let's just pray and all that. So let's continue. So the British withdrawal took place in haste because world opinion was beginning to demand that the colonial powers spend money on their African possessions. If this suggests that Britain exploited its colonies, it simply is not true. If this had been the case, then Britain would have left behind many more factories, plantations, roads, ports, and means of communication in Africa than she did. The vast mass of African people was indifferent or actually would have preferred the British to stay. But neither was it true that the British found in West Africa a land of savage tribes living in crocodile-infested swamps, and by exercising Christian charity and benevolence, carefully instructed the natives in the civilized ways of Western democracy. Do you understand what that means? It's not true that the British found us living in, crocodile-infested swamps, living in disorganized society. That's not true either. It's part of the lies they've kind of like told, maybe to their own children here too, that Africa needed them. We didn't need them. We didn't need Britain. We didn't need any of these colonial colonists. They are thugs, they are criminals, they are savages who disrupted our own, our growth, our progress. And then they wrote the history to make us like we are savages. Our forebears were disorganized and the rest of that. That's not true from the British writer's perspective now. Anyway, so not only is Africa denigrated by the carefully nurtured fairy tale fashioned for the most part in Oxford, but with skill and cunning, the British image is carefully burnished and enhanced. When did Britain itself become a democracy, if it has yet achieved that state? With universal male suffrage in 1884, or when all women got the vote in 1928? Britain's democratic traditions are of more recent origin than most are aware. When the British removed themselves from Nigeria in 1960, though in truth they did not really surrender power to the African people, there was not even universal suffrage, as only a minority of the country's women, those in the South, were entitled to vote. As for tribalism, that well-worn cliché of colonial histories, the pre-colonial societies found in Nigeria were quite sophisticated and could be seen as city-states or nations. And it is the British who have been at war with rebellious Irish tribes for centuries. Can any savagery in Africa equal the Belsians of civilized Western Europe? And the tribal skirmishes, often quoted as an excuse for the British armed occupation, pale to insignificance beside the massive bloody conflict between the European powers. I refer, of course, to the two great wars of 1914 and 1918, and 1939 to 1945. My main qualification for demolishing the myth that the British created viable democracies out of savage tribes only to see the ungrateful and greedy natives quickly revert to their tribalistic ways was my personal involvement in this event. I was educated at Oxford in the traditional manner thought suitable for those who would run the Whitehall civil service machine or the British Empire. Although my tutors tried to persuade me that I could win a first-class degree, I thought they were wrong. Not unnaturally, they wished me to spend the usual 3 years taking the honors degree course in philosophy, politics, and economics. But I found much of the philosophy and economic theory studies congenial, though I had excellent teachers. Against their advice, I took my finals and obtained a second-class degree at the end of my second year. I had already obtained the university diploma in social and public administration, so I was considered particularly well-fitted to serve the crown in Africa. I became a thorn in the flesh of the British government because I chose to believe in democracy and to consider it dishonorable and despicable to tamper with it. But my problem was not that I was expelled from Africa. Quite the contrary. I was offered the highest possible inducement to stay in the service of Her Majesty government. My work was praised, and the British government went to very great length to keep me in the service. Perhaps, fortuitously, this determination to prolong my stay in Africa, Perhaps, fortuitously, this determination to prolong my stay in Africa was to bring me down. For in my final year, the year of the rather tacky, if not wholly charm, independence, I became ill with a chronic disease, tropical sprue. As a result, I have had a quiet and retired life punctuated by alarming health crises. I have not told this story before because I did not wish to wreck the chances of success of the new nation by revealing the truth behind the fine but phony ceremonial retreat. It would not have been possible to write this book in the 1960s anyway, as my health was in ruins and my survival unlikely By the mid-1960s too, the consequences of the British betrayal were becoming evident, and Nigeria was being torn apart by coups, corruption, and civil war. If 1960 was too early, by 1966, it was far too late. When I suggest that the British government meddled with the democratic elections in Nigeria, I write as an authority. I was chosen by His Excellency, the Governor General, Sir James Robertson, to spearhead a covert operation to interfere with the elections. The laws of Nigeria were a sham and largely window dressing to conceal, not mirror, the reality of where power lay. I drafted some of those laws. The Factories Act I drafted was applauded by African leaders as the greatest piece of legislation to be placed on the Nigerian statute book. The National Provident Fund that I pioneered introduced the practical and simple worker savings plan for the largest African nation. Some major institutions, in themselves worthy and popular, were flawed and corrupt, as were the employment exchanges and trade testing organizations. I was in charge of the administration of those bodies and revised the codes of procedure under which they operated. These structures did not become corrupt after independence. They were rotten before the British handed over power to a small and elite group of Africans, who were for the most part thoroughly alienated from their native soil and their compatriots. If they had not been, we would have handed over to a more pro-British group. The new leaders and civil servants were, for the most part, Britishers with black faces. And they continued to rule as the British had ruled, espousing fine ideals and pragmatically willing and dealing and fixing to keep the show on the road. It must be remembered that British colonial power was autocratic, dictatorial power. The British did not practice democracy in Nigeria. They talk about it as a device to legitimize the transfer of power. There was a need to legitimize a new sovereign state, but the British, to the end, were fixing and cheating. And of course, educated Africans were fully aware of this. There were the dictated terms of the charm independence. Whatever the shortcomings of British colonial administration in Africa, some of the more or less well-ordered systems which were handed over to the native populations in the 1960s degenerated fairly quickly into corrupt one-party states. Many of the native peoples must have looked back with regret to independence and wished once more for British rule. Much of this statement is true. Certainly, compared with other imperialist nations, the British behaved well to their native peoples. British historians, civil servants, academics, and the colonial administrators themselves have told the story. However, as I have indicated, they have not always told the whole truth. The historical record does contain some questionable events which have tended to be glossed over. And always, it was the victor who wrote the history, not the subjects' peoples. I was present in Lagos, Nigeria, during the period 1955 to 1960, in the run-up to independence. And my recollection of those years is at variance with the record set down by some British historians. Many Nigerians may feel justly ashamed at some of the events that have marred the early years of the Nigerian nation. The assassination of several heads of state, 5 military coups, and a bloody civil war in the first 25 years is a lot of history Nigeria could have done without. However, on reading my story, it may be seen that the British too did not leave Nigeria with perfectly clean hands. And perhaps the British will be seen to have been in some part to blame for the horrendous events which took place in the 25 years following independence. There are many fine, honest Nigerians who have served their new nation well, and there is much to be proud of in Nigeria's short history. Similarly, there were many fine British administrators who deserve to be remembered for the honorable service they gave in Nigeria. This book is dedicated to those many fine administrators, both blacks and whites, who loved Nigeria and served it with honor. They know who they are, and they can be justly proud of their achievements, whatever blemishes my story may record. It is probably too early to make a balanced assessment of the British occupation of West Africa. I hope this book will make its own small contribution to that record. I have no doubt, however, that the overall assessment will prove that British rule, for all its shortcomings, was beneficial and advanced the welfare of many African people substantially. The supreme betrayal of a new sovereign nation of which I write took place when the British retreated from Nigeria, the African giant, in 1960. The last great act of the British government was to hold democratic elections in 1956 and 1959 to choose the leaders who would inherit supreme power over this vast territory. It seemed that the Nigerian people did not want as its national leaders those educated Nigerians who had campaigned for freedom from British rule. But the election results gave majority power to the leaders of the then backward and feudal North, who had worked closely with the British and were sad to see them go. The British were well satisfied with the election results, though many Nigerians were baffled at the outcome. What I now reveal in these following chapters is that the British government interfered with the election so as to achieve northern domination of Nigeria. The consequences of this abandonment of the rule of law by the British government is recorded in the turbulent and bloody events which were to produce the Biafran Civil War, which grasped the attention of the world due to its daily presence on every nation's television screens. The pictures of starving children and homeless refugees will not soon be forgotten. Since the fraudulent handover of power to the northern leaders in 1960, not only has there been this bloody civil war, which caused death of hundreds of thousands of Nigerians, including many women and children, but 5 heads of states have been assassinated and there have been 3 military coups. I was one of the British officers serving on the headquarters staff in Lagos, chosen by the Governor General, Sir James Robertson, to mastermind the covert action to rig Nigeria's election. This secret operation, hatched in Whitehall, was, of course, a gross betrayal of trust by Prime Minister Sir Anthony Eden and Mr. Harold Macmillan. The orders which arrived on my desk from the Governor General before the elections was the Western Regional Government in 1956 were quite illegal and in direct contravention of Nigerian and British law. As a consequence of these illegal orders, I was to lose my career and my health. These orders were not only illegal, but also immoral, and I refused to carry them out. I also refused many inducements. The authorities wanted me to promise never to reveal how the British government rigged the results of Nigeria's general elections. In 1986, approaching my 60th year, I decided, in compliance with the convention, to seek permission from the Prime Minister, Mrs. Margaret Thatcher, to publish my account of those years in Lagos. I believe that the British people have a right to know what was done in their name, and the people of Nigeria and the Commonwealth need to be made aware of the duplicity and criminal behavior to which some British leaders had resorted when dealing with the African people's struggles for freedom from colonial rule. The British government's response to my plan to write this memoir was totally negative. Mrs. Thatcher refused to reply to my letters. She is not often struck for words, but on this occasion, she was rendered speechless. Assuming that my letter had been suppressed by the Foreign Office, I wrote again using the good offices of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and when that produced no response, the Prince of Wales. I must assume, after all these endeavors, that Mrs. Thatcher has indeed seen my letters and has no objection to the publication of my story of how the British tricked the Nigerian people. The Governor General had told me that I had a choice. I could give my word to keep my mouth shut, and I will continue to be a golden boy, a high flyer, an outstanding officer with appropriate remuneration and rewards, or I would never be employed again by anybody. I chose the latter course. I had no choice, really. Cheating a brand new nation out of its birthright was evidently routine stuff if you were Sir James. I could not see myself getting involved in this kind of intrigue. And of course, I thought I would somehow survive. And of course, I did, even though I found myself permanently retired at 33 with no salary or pension. I had only graduated at Oxford 6 years earlier. During a TV discussion about an MI5 case officer, Kathy Masita, who had resigned and told all, it transpired that MI5 had been partly privatized and was able to turn over unpleasant chores to private detectives. One of these sleuths remarked on TV that he had been asked to check out on a character who had been kept out of employment for 25 years. He had declined the assignment. The Governor General simply could not understand why I should make such a fuss about which set of Africans the British chose to live in charge in Lagos. If I would not play the game, I would have to take the consequences. I suppose this was the way Africans were treated, and it was decided I might profit from the same medicine. One of my neighbors in Lagos was an expert in communist subversion. He swaggered around with his loaded revolver, and when I warned him that burglaries were endemic in Ikoyi, the white area where we white government officials lived, he said any wog who broke into his house would get shot to little pieces. The following morning, he awoke minus his valuables, his clothes, and the gun that he had placed under his pillow. I was very impressed with my neighbor's exploits. His main job was to check all foreign mail coming into Nigeria for Marxist propaganda or letters to subversives. I accompanied him to the post office sorting room in Lagos one day to see where he worked. He remarked, he must be very clever to be able to understand all these foreign languages. I don't speak any foreign lingo, old chap, he assured me. That's where all my years of training come in. I just look at the stamp, all made from iron curtain and red countries. I bung into the fire there and indicated a stove. You don't read it? I asked. Good God, no. It's obvious they are up to no good. So I should worry that my mail was opened and that I was being watched while I pottered around with my dog and cat in my old cottage at Whitbrook. If I became a real threat, who knows, but one day I might be fished out of the canal. The police would no doubt report that I had been complaining of being persecuted and was depressed. Chapter 2, English, I'm proud. I was born in Manchester in 1927 to a great Englishman and his wife. What better name for an English war hero than Aros Smith? In perhaps my first English essay at infant school, I wrote, my father's name is Henry, but my mother calls him Harry. My mother's name is Margaret, but my father calls her Maggie. That was the complete composition, and it pleased my teacher. Short and sweet, Aros Smith, she commented. By that time, we had moved from the dark, tight terraces of Hon to the heavenly, winding avenues of one of Manchester's nicest council estates at Barlow Hall, alongside the meadow, orchards, and farms strung along the banks of the River Massey. In this first literary effort at the new and splendid elementary school built on the Barlow Hall estates, I could have added that my name was Harold, but that I was addressed as our Harold. The family secrets, only revealed after years of pestering, was that my father, the most true blue conservative Englishman it is possible to envisage, was of Irish origin, and so was my mother. Dad had once answered when I had asked him what he was, meaning what work he did. I am an orange man. I told my school friends he worked in a fruit shop. He was actually the key and quite senior employee in a large shirt factory. The cutter, no less. It was his job to lay out the patterns of the various bits of a shirt onto the stacks of stripped flannel material so that the stripe ran the right way and there was as little waste as possible. He was really the boss on the production side of the factory. It was only when I was sent to collect his wages one Friday afternoon, so my mom could do the weekend shopping, that I found this out. He's the boss, ma'am. I gasped. They call him sir and say, yes, Mr. Smith, and no, Mr. Smith. He might be the boss there, but he is not the boss here, responded my mom. He was Irish, an orange man, a Protestant. His family were from Dublin, and he was ashamed of his Irish connection. I was delighted to learn his aunt had been a teacher in Dublin. Someone in the family had actually been educated and read books. My mom and dad never spoke of their background or family history except on very rare occasions. None of your business, they would respond. And we believed they were concealing terrible secrets. It was not just that they were Irish and despised the Irish, but that mom was a Catholic. And that was worse than being Irish for my dad. My mother's sister, my Aunt Nell, rarely called to see us. He hated my father for being an orange man and despised my mother for giving up our Roman Catholic faith to marry my father. To my father and mother, this was of the greatest possible importance. It took many years before I was able to force Mom to reveal that our maiden name was Magari, a clan or tribal name associated with the west of Ireland. I know of no famous Magaris, but I am pleased from time to time to find writers and filmmakers who are Magaris. And one of the Magaris had enough brass to get himself a beautiful coat of arms. Although my father's discharge certificate mentions no special medals for heroic conduct, he was regarded by his many friends as being a war hero. Perhaps this was because he was one of the few who returned from 3 years of trench war with the Manchester Regiment in the Great War of 1914 to 1918. He regarded himself as incredibly lucky. All his friends had died. He had lost an eye and a leg and had a stiff left hand due, he said, to lying on that side for months in hospital beds while his wounds healed. He never complained, but then he did not grumble about anything. He never actually sat still. He was always on the move. Not so much restless, because that would suggest he was nervous, which he was not. He was perfectly content and sure of himself. He was highly principled, a boss's man, a Freemason, a heavy drinker, an orange man, a conservative, and he loved his country without the slightest reservation. Before the war, my father had been a keen athlete, and his weekends were taken up by football and long-distance running. After the war, with the young men dead or busy elsewhere, he was taken to the pubs and feted by the older men. Later, when he was established in a good job, it was his turn to repay their generosity, and every night of his life, he bought drinks for anyone and everyone. My mother had started drinking to try to stop him, but she had rapidly become hooked and probably drank more than he did. Eventually, she died of cirrhosis of the liver. Dad was always right and never saw two sides to any question. He was strict, unbending, without a hint of ambiguity. And although he inflicted much pain and suffering on his children, he was respected and adored. The rules had to be learned and were reinforced with a cuff on the side of the head. Don't answer back. Don't be cheeky. Speak when you are spoken to. Who are you looking at? Look at me when I speak to you. And general rules: a man, a gentleman, never strikes a woman or ever lay hands on her. ever lays hands on her. This rule made me an extremely reserved and inhibited teenager. Perhaps I was so popular with the girls because I did not try anything on, as the saying used to be. My best friend got an older girl pregnant when he was 15. I had not got to the kissing stage at that age. Truth telling had to be 100%, and lies brought on kicks as well as blows. I never lied to him, but sometimes he did not believe me, and I would dive under the table for protection. Only rarely did he move the table, so I was able to dodge his gammy leg, which was swung with great force. If the table was moved, my mother would intervene as I scrambled to get under the sideboard. I'll kill this little sod. I will throttle him or swing for him. My mom used to say, no one will poison you, you little bugger. You were born to swing. Practically all the money surplus to food and rent and coal went on alcohol. Money for clothing or anything else was only extracted with great difficulty and after continual nagging and pleading. From my bedroom window, I could see through the trees and the ancestral home of the Barlows. During the long month of mysterious illness which beset me throughout childhood, I peopled the hall with its generations of Barlow children in strange costume and saw in my imaginations its hung with dark paintings and Barlow nights. My father had no need of the ancient equivalent of a family photograph album to know where he belonged and who he was. He was ex-private Aros Smith of the Manchester Regiment, an officer of the ancient order of Buffaloes. Although I adore him, our life path diverged from the very start. One of the Barlows, Ambrose, was a Catholic martyr and had been cruelly executed. Ambrose Barlow was one of my saints before he was canonized. To follow in Jesus' footsteps and pay the ultimate price for his faith, there was a man I doubt my dad knew of his existence, for although intelligent, he had little education and never knew him to open a book or read anything except the Daily Mail and racing papers. When we sang my favorite hymn, There is a Green Hill Far Away, in the hall during assembly at Barlow Hall School, I saw Ambrose Barlow on a cross beside Jesus and revered the Catholic Church for producing men of Ambrose Barlow's caliber. Dad would have been perplexed by Ambrose's Catholicism, but I feel sure he would have responded to his heroism. My father served his king and country. The only top person he ever criticized, and that below his breath, so he would barely be heard, was General L. Haig. Bloody generals. What did they care? It was like a bleeding butcher's shop. What did Haig care? Then he would swing his leg and shut himself away in the kitchen. Dad's crying in the kitchen. He was sobbing. Mom, I would say, leave him be. He would say, it's the war. When very young, I would ask, why are you crying, Dad? Once he said, for my old comrades I left in France. But usually he would say, I'm not crying. It's my eye watering. And he would slip out his glass eye and wash it under the tap at the sink. When my body burned with fever as if I was on fire, I slept in his bed and would watch as he unstrapped the canvas and leather belt which held his artificial leg in place. One of his boots was laced permanently to his gammy leg, and he would leave the leg with the boot attached inside the trousers when he undressed. Then he would remove the special white socks made to measure for his leg stump and rub away the pain. Only my mother would know when his stump was raw and sore. It was a point of honor not to complain. It was something men did not do. So for the fevers, my father prescribed Fennin's fever cure, which was highly thought of because it tasted ghastly. Dad knew about such things because he had had ambulance training and for a time had been a stretcher bearer in France. To us children, he was truly a medical expert, even if his remedies included sweaty socks for sore throat and peeing on your feet for foot rot. Perhaps this was the poor, bloody infantry's treatment for French feet. I would swim out of a delirium to find my dad clinging to me. Our flannel shirts would sometimes be soaking with sweat. But sometimes I would be in one of those tranquil, cool periods between fevers when my brain, though no longer inflamed, saw everything so clearly. And it was my dad who was tortured in his sleep and reenacting a battle in the trenches. Sometimes it was possible to make sense of the incoherent flow of shouts and orders. Perhaps that was how the real battle was. Sometimes pieces made sense. Mr. Edwards, sir, Mr. Jones presented his compliments and requested you to bring up your men immediately, sir. We are under heavy attack. They are in the trench. There will be a pause then. Oh God, Jesus Christ, they are all dead. Bits and pieces of bodies everywhere. Jim, Bob, where are you? Then Dad will begin to sob, and I will try to comfort him. I was brought up to serve king and country and the empire. I was a boy soldier, and as such, treated like a man. A man never ran away. He always stood his ground. A man never laid hands on a woman. The reason, as I have said, for my being regarded as a nice boy by girls and their mothers when in my teens. Impatient girls undid their blouse buttons and put my coat hand inside to warm. One can be too nice. 60 Maitland Avenue was on the edge of the estate next to a new Methodist chapel, which also housed a branch of the public library. Beyond the chapel was the farm which had served Barlow Hall and carried its name. The parameters of my early influences were within 200 yards of our front gates. Reading about the Barlows led me into local history while I was too young to join the library. From the local history, it was a short step to local politics and city council debates. The liberals seemed to be responsible for the building of the council estates, so I became a liberal. Don't be so bloody daft, was my dad's response. We are conservatives. All my dad's beliefs were like final and forever. Although I adored my mom and dad, one of my earliest recollections, following on those being fed with pop and later Farley's rusks and squatting on the Daily Mail and grunting, was of total disbelief that at what I was saying, I was propped up with cushions on a settee, watching my mom and dad and brothers and sisters. The furniture was cheap and unattractive. How did I know? The conversation was in bits and pieces, accusing, mock, threatening, whining from the children. It was not elevating or educated, but common and even vulgar. I was repelled and alienated. Why had I come here? I was in the wrong place. Some awful mistakes had been made. I was a weakling. Something had to be done. I had to be taught to fight and uphold the family honor. Up the buffs was my dad's cry to arms. At every opportunity, I was expected to fight. If my mother stood at the gate, she would challenge a passing primo canera or budding Tommy Farr and cry, "My lad can beat you." They would look at me and laugh, which only encouraged my mother. "Call yourself a lad of mine and you won't fight," she would say. "But ma'am, I don't want to fight." "Don't you want to stick up for your mother then? Say someone attacks your mother. Fat lot of good you'd be." Harry, my oldest brother, will look after his mother. "See that boy coming. He's very nasty. Go and get him." That's talking about his mom. And so began my career as a prize fighter. Nobody fought harder, longer or more often. I got used to pain, bruises, split lips, black eyes, scratches, kicks. In fact, I welcomed them as it made my mother happy. I was a real boy. I never won a fight in all those years and never desired to, but I never ran away. I would get off the floor time after time until my assailant would explain he would lose face if he kept knocking down someone who obviously could not fight for toughly. He wiped the floor with you, said my mother scornfully, after watching a somewhat unequal contest with a boy the size of a furniture van. How I longed for her to rescue me and tell me I was brave, but she never did. You don't want to be a bloody clerk, said my dad when I was 11 and took the scholarship examination. So I ended up at Charlton Park Elementary Boys School, or rather, after 2 minutes in the playground, winded and bleeding. I was picked up. My arms were threaded through the school railings, and I was then thoroughly beaten. The gravel embedded in my knees turned septic. And when the delirium finally cleared, I had been away from school for 10 weeks. I had no idea that I was dying, that the doctors had given me up. In 1938, the wonder cure for septicemia, penicillin, had not yet been discovered. It was just delirium, another fever. But it seemed like coming back from a far country, and I did not care whether or not I arrived. On one of these occasions, early on, I became aware of the doctor examining me. Hello, he said. It's the first time I've seen you conscious. I'm a Dr. P. I don't know what's wrong with you. I'm bringing a colleague to see you. Dr. P was apologetic when the other doctor arrived. The new doctor assured him he had done the right thing. Let's start again, he suggested. We'll examine him from top to toe. They pulled off my pants. Then they saw my knees. They could not miss the abrasions and scabs. They patted my legs and found a large black swelling in the groin. Septicemia, they exclaimed. The decline continued. There was no cure. I would become conscious to find Dr. P bathing my body to get the temperature down. We are both in trouble, he said. Ages later, I swam out of delirium and he said, maybe I was going to make it. My temperature was falling. Very gradually, I recovered, and Dr. P would sit by my bedside doing his pool's coupon. He would bring me piles of expensive American comics, and then he stopped coming. My father would not tell me why. I felt somehow it was my fault. When is he coming back? I would plead. My father said he was not coming back. He had been struck off for gambling debts. I did not believe my father. It could not be true. If it were true, I would not have wanted to leave. In my absence from school, the preliminaries in the Charlton Park worldwide street fighting competition had taken place, and the whole school acknowledged that Alan Dawson was the world champion. I met the world champion as soon as I arrived back at school. You are new, aren't you? Not really, I replied. Listen, I can beat everyone in this school, said Dawson. I guess he thought I looked a pale, thin weakling who had just got off his deathbed. You can't beat me, I said. Are you kidding? Said Dawson. I could blow you over. He gave me a push which would have sent me 6 feet if the railing had not been there, feet away. I'd not been 3 feet away. You can knock me down, I said, but I'll never admit you can beat me. You're crazy, said Dawson. I'm not going to fight you. In due course, Dawson became my friend. Why wouldn't you admit I could beat you? He would plead. You were the only one in the school who wouldn't submit. I can't, I said. It's the way I was brought up. So 10 weeks into my new school, and I had not had a lesson or met a teacher. I was really looking forward to my first class. Besides, I had survived my first encounter with Dawson. I did not know which line to join in the playground when the whistle blew. Somehow, I found myself joining a woodwork class. I stood out in the workroom because I did not possess a white apron. I was told to stand by a bench. All the other boys were planning and sawing, and forever holding up pieces of wood to check with set squares. I picked up a wooden plane and hastily put it down when Mr. Ladd, the woodwork teacher, glowered at me. Then he charged across, grabbed me by the hair, and dragged me to his desk. I have told you time and again for months, he yelled, never to put a plane down on his blade. The rest of the class gathered around in eager anticipation. From his desk, Mr. Ladd extracted a long leather strap. The ends of the strap were cut into thongs. Hands up, boy, one under the other, yelled Mr. Ladd. A cat of nine tails, somebody murmured gleefully. Mr. Ladd was not angry. His face was lit up. His eyes were gleaming. His tongue was hanging out. He skipped forward as if going to bowl out Don Bradman. He could not have tried harder to tear the fingers from my hand. I got 6 of the best, 3 on each hand. As he was preparing to take aim, a quiet boy wearing spectacles tried to intercede. He's new, sir. It's his first lesson. Shut up, yelled Mr. Ladd. I've told him a dozen times. I was not too upset by all this. I was used to pain, and the school bullies left me alone. Apparently, Dawson had let it be known that he was the only one who was going to beat me up. The school probably thought I was a nutcase. And Mr. Ladd, nobody liked him very much as he was not a proper teacher, and the other staff rated him on a level with the stoker who fed the school's boilers. But he later became the hero of every boy in the school. In 1939, war was declared, and Mr. Ladd, as the dog's body, was voted to be in charge of air raid precautions. As timber was in short supply, he had a good excuse for not handing out any wood for the boys to work with. As he had always been mean and acted as if it were his wood he was handing out, he was very pleased to walk around wearing a thin hat and blowing his whistle. Instead of ghastly woodwork, we now got lectures, often very imaginative, or what to do if the enemy bombed us. During one of his talks, he told us what to do if the Hun decided to drop gas bombs on shouting "Come Hardy." We would hear gas rattles, which Mr. Ladd demonstrated. Apparently, as soon as Mr. Ladd learned that the Germans were going to wipe us out with gas, he would ride around on his bicycle, rotating his gas rattle. We would then all put on our gas masks. However, this would not help if the enemy were dropping mustard gas. How would we know if we were being bombed with mustard gas? Asked a brave ex-woodworker. Mr. Ladd looked at him as he had once looked at me, and I feared he was going to demonstrate his skills with the cat of nine tails again. You will know about it. You just wait and see, he threatened. So what do we do if we get covered in the mustard gas, Mr. Ladd? Please, sir. A very good question. Mr. Ladd, with a snarl, he would have smiled, but there was a war on. You take all your clothes off immediately. In the streets, someone exclaimed. Anywhere, said Mr. Ladd. Women too, said a brave soul. Women too, everybody, stark naked, said Mr. Ladd. So Mr. Ladd was warming to his work. Perhaps he was thinking of riding on his bicycle, giving his rattle alarm for a practice mustard gas attack and making everybody he encountered stripped stark naked. What do we do then, Mr. Ladd, please, sir? Asked the class. You run to the nearest house, ring the doorbell, run inside, and jump in the bath. What if there's a lady in the bath? The whole class gasped. Tell her to move over and get in with her, shouted Mr. Ladd, full of excitement, all naked in the bath together. With that, he ran out of the room with his tin hat and rattle, and the class broke up to run around the school, telling everyone to spray for a mustard gas attack. The girls got quite hysterical. Next day, a deputation of anxious mothers waited on the headmaster to ask why their daughters were expected to strip naked when Mr. Ladd performed with his rattle. Mr. Ladd became extremely popular, and his stories, like all good yards, were added to beyond all recognitions. When Mr. Ladd suddenly disappeared, it was obvious to all the boys that the headmaster, jealous of Mr. Ladd's incredible popularity, had volunteered him for something very nasty, like being dropped behind enemy lines with his tin hat and gas rattle. That's the end of chapter 2. Now, chapter 3. Early years and RAF, Royal Air Force, that is a RAF. So when I was a small child, I would help my brother, my older brother, Harry, with his newspaper round in Northenden, an attractive Cheshire village, which was in danger of being swamped by the Manchester sprawl. When Harry left school and got a job delivering fruits and vegetables in Northenden, I helped out on Saturday mornings. I was 9 years of age when a university team of researchers into child employment caught up with me. I had enjoyed giving my mother the 1 shilling and 6 pence and a bag of fruits, though she was never very impressed. So for 2 years, I was unemployed. Although my mother sent me for a number of jobs, I pretended to be stupid so as not to be employed as a butcher's boy. My mother was very disappointed. She liked the idea of cheap or free meat. When I was 11, she found me a morning newspaper round which paid 3 shillings and 6 pence a week. Then an evening round for another 3 shillings and 6 pence. Mr. Burgess at the farm, at the bottom of our council estate street, could see I was a keen worker. So I took on a milk round too, at 7 shillings a week. I started delivering milk at 5 in the morning until the air raid started, and I was at risk of getting in the way of fire engines and rescue squads. After my evening paper round, I turned up at the farm to help bottle the milk for next morning. At the weekends, I collected cash from my customers on the milk round and did odd jobs on the farm. In the holidays, I cleared pigsties and weeded and picked potatoes. My mother was not too happy when I left school and started an engineering apprenticeship at the vast metropolitan Vickers factory. I only earned 14 shillings a week at the factory. I loathed engineering. My first department was H machine. I arrived the morning after it got a direct hit from a German bomb. The lathes and the milling machines were hanging from their drive belt in mid-air. I was moved to K machine. The lavatories at K machines were in two facing rows and were so close that legs stretched into the walkway between. My father had lost his job as a shirt cutter and had volunteered for war work. I found him dragging trucks piled high with iron castings on K machine. The management had not noticed he had an artificial leg and a glass eye, and he did not tell them. It was intensely patriotic. Women had been conscripted in large numbers into the factory and rapidly proved, after only a short training period, to be better machine workers than the men. This caused a lot of resentment. There was a great deal of flirtation, and even the middle-class ladies who were well-spoken seemed to enjoy the sexual banter and innuendo. My job was to drag 2 large steel baskets of brews of brew, tins to a lean to boiler house at lunchtime and otherwise run errands. A surprising number of men would either try to grab my pennies or stroke my bottom. Some would try to get me to go home with them. If this was homosexuality, there seemed to be an awful lot of working-class homosexuals at metropolitan vehicles. The blue shirts were dangerous too. Sexual attacks disguised as initiation ceremonies were common. I learned to run fast and cry at night. The nightmares I had, then I have had ever since. The initiation involved masturbation by an older youth and sometimes variations like jamming a narrow-topped bottle onto a boy's penis so he could not move it when he had an erection. If he did not get an erection, a girl would be persuaded for a laugh to expose her breast or raise her skirts. At 15, I was on some errand when I stopped to chat to another brew boy from the research department. I agreed to swap secrets. They had few sexual initiation in research. The people there were graduates and college apprentices and scientists, a better class of workers. So I recounted my stories of decay high brew sheds, and he told me the secret of the atomic bomb, which they were working on in the top secret research department. A little later, I moved to West Works, where I helped to assemble the switch gear panels for the Victoria Falls Power Station and mobile switch gear unit for the Soviet Union. My national service in the RAF followed a predictable pattern. I tried hard not to be an electrician, so I became one. At Merksham in Wiltshire, I was pushed through advanced courses in electronics, which I found totally boring. We had to be reasonably bright, and our intake included a sprinkling of grammar and public school boys and students. When taking the end of course examinations, I was surprised to get high marks. You remember very little, so you work out all the answers from theory and principles, I was informed. The others only remember what they've been told. I was asked what rank I would like. I settled for a pass. I was terrified I would be given stripes and recruited as an instructor. At Merksham, I discovered the joys and delight of Bath and spent my weekends in the Salvation Army hostel, which was situated on a blitz size. I made friends with a family who lived in a modest but attractive terrace house, which clung to the hillside under Beechen Cliff. This pleasant terrace on Carlton Road, like much else in Bath, was to be destroyed by supposedly educated town planners or grid and replaced by ghastly egg boxes with flat roofs and picture windows. My rider was a shop steward at Stohart and Pitt's Crane Factory, and Mrs. Ryder was an activist in the local Labour Party. At that time, the Bath Labour Party had their meeting place in the very beautiful Lansdowne Terrace. I had never met such a nice group of people, and they were very kind to me. I knew then that one day I would return to Bath. Much of what I needed to bath my eyes and make my heart sing was available free in Bath. Meanwhile, Bath is like an area, okay? So that you know it's not like a bath or shower. So with BBC Radio and some library tickets, most of my needs would be satisfied. That dream was to come true, but only because my wife kept me alive in extremis. And I have behind me two delightful daughters, my collie and Persian cat. I volunteered for service in Germany and was sent to Egypt. Here we lived in tents, which were cool because the floor was 2 or 3 feet deep into the sand. The floor and sides were lined with packing case timber. and we fashioned chairs, tables, and shelves from the same source. After a year in the canal zone, the RAF were reluctant to let me go when my demobilization notice came through. As I was already heading for 3 years service, I was not too pleased. My problem was that I had been too keen and had acquired a great deal of experience on various aircrafts. Spares were short, so we did a lot of patching up. From time to time, we would ask a pilot to land with his wheels up, what we would call a pancake, so that we could strip the plane, Christmas trees, to keep the rest of the flight flying. So the pilots were quite agreeable to a crash landing from time to time. They loved flying and would plead with us to sign Form 700 so they could take off. The problem with electrics in a very hot climate is that the insulation melts. The fire switches were held in place by blobs of pitch, which also often melted, leaving the engines awash with foam. One Lancaster had very temperamental inflatable raft, which kept popping up on the wings. The trick was to get everything to work. At the same time, we would sign the plane as fit to fly. It was only a matter of hours or days before something else would go wrong. The aircraft were clapped out, but the pilots were very easygoing. One effective precaution was to make all the ground crew fly on the first flight after a major refit. We would have to search for some of the ground crew and ignore their sick bay cheats. The aircraft hangars at Casfarit contained mountains of small arms which had been collected from the surrendering German and Italian armies in North Africa. These armaments were in great demand, and twice a week we spent the night in searchlight towers along the barbed wire perimeter fence. I had been a washout and had refused to hit the target during my rifle training at Ratusden in Suffolk. When I arrived in Egypt, the station armament officer decided I could be very easily made into a crack shot. He invited me to spend every afternoon when the heat was intolerable at an open rifle range. He presented me with an inexhaustible supply of bullets and told me I could fire for forever and a day until I got 6 in the center of the target. I knew I had met my match. I got down on the floor behind the sandbags and put 6 bullets in the bullseye. One night, I was swinging my searchlight and trying to dodge the large dung beetles, which hit the lamp and fell at my feet, when a stern gun opened up and bullets flew around my head. The rifle came up and I fired a magazine automatically. I was furious that the RAF had succeeded in training me against all my inclination to become a rifleman. My inhibition was not unconnected with my father's experiences in the trenches in France. My chums in the guard room were convinced I was dead. It's a bit of a letdown, you being alive, Smithy, said one. We were all saying what a smashing bloke you were. We felt very sorry for you. You've been dead. Now you've gone and spoiled it. After this time, I was summoned to see my wing commander and was given a dressing down. I have here a report on your work signed by your flight sergeant before he returned to the UK. He said your work was excellent. That is a grade reserved for officers. Aircraftsmen are satisfactory. NCOs, very good, and only officers are excellent. Is that understood? He didn't tell me, sir, I said. All right then, he replied. So long as you know your grade is satisfactory. At that time, the British were withdrawing from Palestine, and questions were being asked in Parliament about war supplies being released by the British to the Egyptian army. Arms may not have been released, but we were aware that vast quantities of vehicles and other supplies were being auctioned at army warehouses in Canal Zone. The impression we had was that Ernest Bevin, the Labour Foreign Secretary, was anti-Semitic. Later, I was to meet RAF people who had come out of Palestine, who showed off photographs taken at Kibbuzim after attacks by Arabs. Pits were filled with bodies of young boys and girls. On the troop ship from Port Said, I met another of these anti-Semite officers. While standing at the rail one night as we sailed through the Mediterranean, he showed me some more of these pictures of atrocities. As I expressed disgust and went away, I paused and very seriously contemplated pushing that RAF corporal over the rail into the sea. During that voyage back to Liverpool in August 1948, I cleaned the latrines all the way through the Mediterranean. The girls on the dockside were wearing black outfits, which went halfway down their calves. It was the new look in fashion. A few days later, we were demobbed from the RAF, and I was on the train to Manchester in a brown tweed suit, which felt very rough. At once, I missed the RAF. The RAF was enjoyable because we had been conscripted. As we had no choice, we could make the best of it and dream of what we would do when we got out. Now the dreaming had to stop and harsh reality hit me. I tried desperately to get any kind of job, but there was nothing. I would have to return to the factory in Trafford Park. Within days, it was as if I had never been away. I would have gone insane if I had not been saved by my old mate, Frank Ferrost, the shop steward. Frank had news of a junior engineers conference organized by our society, the Amalgamated Engineering Union. I attended that conference and was pitchforked into battles with the communists. I was outraged to discover that they rigged elections and found that they fought dirty. I was very quickly elected to the Trades Council, the executive of the Fabian Society, the executives of the City Labour Party. So the following year, I was a candidate for the City Council. When Frank Ferrost stood down as shop steward, I was elected to replace him, and Frank became a foreman. The communists now saw their chance, and the district committee refused to issue me with credentials as a shop steward. The works director had wanted Frank to remain shop steward. I only pretended to force him out. Frank wanted the foreman's job. However, the works director was displeased with me, and very rapidly, to the delight of the communists, I was out of a job. The major battle in the unions in Manchester were between the communists and the Roman Catholics. The communists often seemed to be ex-Catholics, and in time, they would either return to the church or join some other political group. They sought strong authority and doctrine. People like myself were in the middle and got shut up by both sides. I found a job in an aircraft factory. Was it true? The communists asked that I was collecting books for a book fair for the Labour Party League of Youth. Would I like a pile of books? How kind, I thought. I was checking some writing on an aircraft when a security officer ordered me to report to the personnel department. Someone had been smoking or taking a break on that aircraft. I wasn't smoking or taking a break, I protested. You are going anyway, said the security officer. Have you seen your bench? The works of Lenin, Marx, Engels, and Stalin were stacked high on my bench. The communists howled with laughter. Have a good read, they shouted. I had been out of work a few weeks when a printer on a newspaper asked if I would like a job. It was a keyboard operator. The salary seemed enormous. I can't type, I said. You won't be allowed to. It's a union agreement. They've got rid of a machine, but they've got to employ an extra man. And what do I do all night? I asked. Nothing. You won't be allowed to. I declined a well-paid job. I disapproved strongly of this kind of trade unionism. I saw an advertisement in the Guardian for university extramural courses at Holyroyd College. I began to find temporary laboring jobs, and in between times, attended courses at Holyroyd. The tutor at Holyroyd was an ascetic intellectual with great warmth and wit. Ralph Ruddock took an interest in what I was doing and began to push books my way. Why don't you go to university? Ralph asked one day. It's impossible, I protested. Ralph asked what I thought of one of the visiting lecturers. Okay, I replied, not very bright. Right, said Ralph. He's got a couple of degrees and you are brighter than he is. Remember, knock on plenty of doors. Some doors will be slammed in your face, but eventually you'll find someone who's been waiting for you. This was excellent advice. In October 1950, I got on a coach to Oxford. I had a Sir Ernest Cassell scholarship and a place at Ruskin College. On the coach with me was a shop steward friend who was unemployed. We had met a couple of weeks earlier and I had asked him if he would like to go to Oxford. Ruskin won't take you without money, and the city council won't give you a grant unless you have a place at college. I told him, so write to Ruskin and say you have the money, and to the council and say you have the place. I helped my friend write an essay for Ruskin on the closed shop. The opening sentence of his draft commenced, the non-trade unionist in the factory is a Philistine within the gate who must be eliminated. We start, I suggested. Some will say that the non-trade unionists, then we put the other point of views and proceed that way all through the essay like two people having an argument. And at the end, my friend asked, sum it up, pros and cons, and if you want my opinion, settle for tolerance or leave it open. You'll enjoy Oxford, I assured him. So 2 years later, when I moved to Magdalen College, my one-time friend won a scholarship to Balliol. He became a psychologist and took a doctorate and became a director of a research unit. He had collected some smart friends and cultivated a posh accent. I was saddened. He was much nicer when he was a radical shop steward. The Oxford years. Thank you very much for listening. I know I do not have a lot of listeners, okay, because some people just prefer, let's talk about what's going on right now. But at the same time, a lot of people also wanted to know, how did we get here? So all these stories like this, they can be very helpful in giving you the closure and understanding of how Nigeria got to what Nigeria is now, okay? So thank you so much for listening, to those of you who are still there. We have just about 25 minutes to go, okay? Because I've only got just 120 minutes to start this reading, and it's going on well so far, okay? So chapter 4, the Oxford years. My first year at Oxford involved a great deal of travel. I had foolishly assumed that on arrival at Ruskin, I would immediately receive my scholarship money. It was not to be. On leaving Manchester, I had pressed what money I had on others who needed it more and arrived at the college on Walton Street penniless. I was met by the college secretary, Betty Smith, who said, you'll be staying at the Rockery in Eddington, and bundled me into a taxi. Don't go away. I advised the taxi driver when we arrived at what had obviously been a large country house. I then tried to explain my predicament to the students I encountered. Conway Morgan came to my rescue. He was to be my roommate, and he was rolling a cigarette with one hand when we first met. He said nothing, but pressed paper money into my sweaty palm. During this maneuver, he seemed to manage to keep one hand in his pocket and continue rolling his cigarettes in a Rizzler paper with the other. no mean feat. It was like that. Con was a very dark Welshman who would be eloquent but otherwise, who could be eloquent but otherwise, unless he had something important to say, preferred silence. He chose leaving Oxford to work in a bostall. I had encouraged Con to take up social work so that I would have someone to accompany me to the Isle of Dogs. Con did not merely sympathize with the poor and down and out and criminals, but totally empathized with them, and he took a rather jaundiced view of anyone in authority. I had chosen the right man to ask for a loan to pay for my taxi. Some of our lectures were given in Eddington and others at Walton Street. And of course, we attended university lectures. For our social work course, we were attached to Barnet House, the social work faculty, who in turn packed us off to London's East End for months on end. The rockery at Eddington was therefore mostly a base camp for our first year. In December 1950, I attended a student conference at Transport House. The chairman was an old friend from Manchester University, Peter Morris. "You are going to have your photograph taken for the Daily Herald," said Peter. "Pick out a pretty girl from the hall." At the back of the hall was a young lady with a golden halo. The halo was her plaited fair hair pinned up. I pointed to her and called, and she came forward. That was how I met Carol. We had our photographs taken. I think that's a Carol. See, it's Carol there. So we had our photographs taken. Let's try again. And the next day, I apologized for being a bit slow and asked her to marry me. There were a lot of good-looking men at that conference, and I was taking no chances. We sat holding hands in the foyer of Transport House when the porter decided to play Cupid and showed us into the TUC General Chamber. "It will be warmer up here and a bit more private," he said, which goes to show one should never underrate the TUC. The brothers mean what they say about love and fraternity. Trade unionists are magnificent people, sometimes a little foolish because they are very ordinary like the rest of us, but big-hearted, very generous and very loyal. What few conservative politicians understand is that they are also intensely patriotic, conservative and yet liberal-minded, and the salt of the heart. Harold Macmillan understood them. An Oxford lady invited me to attend an orchestra concert at the Sheldonian. The concert was more enjoyable. I sent a letter of thanks, and that is how I became a friend of Miss Rosemary Spooner and her cousin, Miss Ruth Spooner. I was invited to lunch and thoroughly enjoyed the burnt sausages and mash. I detest rare sausages. Miss Rosemary and I had a contest of apologies. She apologized for the burnt sausages. I apologized for being so greedy and eating every last burnt sausage. I think I won. Henceforth, I was introduced to everyone in Oxford, or everyone in Oxford attended the Spooner Sunday teas as the politest man in Oxford. "I'm told you are the politest man in Oxford," said one curious lady at a Sunday tea. I like burnt sausages, I confessed. "Tell me," she said, "what is the university? Is it the colleges?" The politest man in Oxford spent an hour telling Sir Maurice Bora's wife all about Oxford University. I think Lady Bora was trying to prove she was the politest lady in Oxford, because she said, "Really? How interesting," at least 20 times. On the other hand, as she was undoubtedly sending me up, perhaps she was really the rudest lady in Oxford, but I was too polite to tell her. "You really are deaf, Harold," said Miss Rosemary one Sunday afternoon. "I really don't think so, Miss Spooner," I responded. "Humor me, Harold," said Miss Spooner. "I've made an appointment for you at the Radcliffe tomorrow. So you are not deaf, said the hearing specialist. That's right, I said. The specialist covered his lips with his hand and continued talking. I tried to peer around his hand. How could I hear if I could not see? Can you hear now? He asked, letting me see his lips. He stuck a hearing aid in my ear and I recoiled. The traffic noise was awful and a whole aviary of birds were singing madly. I was being assaulted by a battery of sound. So, courtesy of Miss Spooner, I became officially deaf and was issued a hearing aid. When I wore it, I didn't need to turn it on as people shouted my head off. Not that I had much time for social activity at Magdalen. There were 100 tutorials to attend and 100 essays to write. We were all so busy. Friends one wanted to know better. Alf Morris, Guy Barrett, Gerard Kaufman, Fred Jaffis, all rushed by. Hi, how are you? Fine, see you. Each week at Miss Spooner's, one knew where there had been a revolution because she always had 40, the very latest batch of refugees. One sometimes wondered where last month's refugees had gone. Everyone was made to feel somebody special. I had my title, a shy Dagenham shop steward, which seems improbable, blossomed after being introduced several times as a very important trade union official. Another visiting shop steward held the whole room transfixed with a long, boring yarn, but it was not his story, which was spellbinding. It was his table knife, which he waved above his head in a repeat of the speech which paralyzed London docks. The Spooner's guests were not quite paralyzed, more hypnotized as they watched the docker's knife, for clinging to the end of the knife was a blob of raspberry jam. Did we take their stinking offer? Demanded the docker. The assembled professors and refugees shook their heads vigorously. No, we didn't, said the docker emphatically, the knife and its cargo of jam cleaving the air. On the last syllable, the knife and jam parted company and everyone's eyes rose to the ceiling with the raspberry jam and then down to the fine Persian carpet where it landed. Oh, sorry, exclaimed the docker, and he ground the jam into the carpet pattern with his foot, or his boots. What a thrilling story, said Miss Spooner faintly. Lovely jam days, said the docker, reloading his knife. If I was polite, what were the Spooner ladies? Saints? I think. Returning from a sojourn in Shoreditch, which had been made more tolerable by that area's Shakespearean connections, I found that an oafish oligarchy of northern barbarians masquerading as trade unionists had taken over the House Committee at Eddington, and were being a bore. These were not brothers, but old-fashioned bullies, and they had drawn up long, detailed rules and regulations which licensed them to annoy and irritate fellow students. While I was luxuriating in a hot bath one morning, one of the comrades burst in on me to announce that this was criminal activity. The committee had drawn up a timetable and one could only bath by consulting these dreary documents and taking a dip at an allotted time. As the bathrooms were mostly vacant with hot water gargling in the pipes at all hours, this seems like an attempt to turn our Sylvian Oxford retreat into a Stalinist labor camp. I found a fellow conspirator I needed playing the piano in the common room after dinner. Robin Higgs was a quite unique at Ruskin. He was a London trolley bus driver whose mother played the piano in pubs in Holloway. Nothing odd in that. What made Rob special was that he was an extremely right-wing conservative. He also had a marvelous sense of fun and was an absolutely brilliant musician and mathematician. The simple belief we shared was that liberty and freedom were the hallmarks of civilization, and they ranked higher than food and shelter in our scale of values. While the oligarchy debated and bullied over coffee in the common room, I would encourage Robin at the piano to compose saucy ditties satirizing these idiots who made up with malice and violence for what they lacked. Idiots who made, for what they lacked in wit and charm. The oligarchy was already restive, for some anonymous benefactor had stolen their set of rules and regulations, and without their constitution, the barbarians found it difficult to move motions. They spent a lot of time moving motions. Robin's aim to the clean and decent, which he composed extemporaneously, that evening stirred them up even more. No bath today, but we are dirty. No bath today. What can we do? Take a furtive dip with a question mark and risk persecution? Big Brother is at the keyhole watching you. So that evening, returning from a rare visit to a local pub, the staircase in the rockery was dark. As I reached for the banister rail, yells and the thud of falling bodies came from the top of the staircase. I stood aside as the thugs of the oligarchy stumbled and bounced down the stairs. Sorry, lads, said Robin, who was massively built. I didn't see you crouching on the stairs in the dark. Robin revealed to me over a mug of coffee that he had overheard the mob planning a tiny side Friday night ritual, namely to kick the shit out of someone. The target was my good self, and the lads had removed the light bulb and were lying in wait when Rob had accidentally kicked them down the stairs. Not since school days, when belatedly the school champ Dawson had become my chum, had I known the joy of having a protector. Robin's massive presence terrified the oligarchy. They never found their rules and regulations. Where did you hide your ghastly constitution, Robin? I asked one sunny day. The one place those ignorant bastards would never think to look, said Robin. The library? Naturally, said Robin. So Ruskin had been a delightful experience. The college specializes in courses for matured students, and I found the tutors to be very kind and generous with their time. Ruskin is in no way inferior to older, richer, and more prestigious colleges of the university and achieves extremely high academic standards. Ruskin is an oasis of liberal, civilized values to which students and their scholars have been drawn from all over the world. It was established by two young idealistic Americans at the end of the 19th century, an act of great generosity from the new world to the old. I now had a problem, and Billy Hughes, the principal of Ruskin, was, quite rightly, rather cross. I had been accepted to read philosophy, politics, and economics at St. Catherine's Society by the censor, a reverend gentleman, and I had changed my mind. What are you playing at, Arod? Asked Billy Hughes. You've done extremely well to be accepted, and now you say you won't go? But I've also been accepted by Magdalene, I said, and Balliol are quite keen. Good God, Arod, said Billy. How many colleges have you applied for? 12, I said. I was taking Ralph Rudolph's advice literally. I didn't think any of them would want me, I added. I apologized to Billy Hughes and suggested we take it that I had gone the wrong way about applying for admittance to a college and had been severely reprimanded. He should reply to the censor accordingly and smooth his feathers. And would I go to St. Catherine's? Asked Billy. No, I said. He wrote me an extremely abusive letter without giving me a chance to explain. I acted in ignorance. That letter was meant to hurt. The censor of St. Catherine's was not mollified. If I would not go to his college, the doors of every other Oxford college would be barred to me. Perhaps the president of Magdalene had seen me out of politeness. His butler had taken my dirty raincoat and held it at arm's length. The president's study had large faded tapestries covering the walls. "Hello, Mr. Smith," said Boaz. "Excuse the old cloth. I'm weeding the garden." The butler poured the tea from an exquisite Georgian teapot, and I thought, this is better than working in the factory. "So what have you been doing, with yourself?" asked the president. I explained about Ruskin. I had a university diploma in public administration and had been awarded a state scholarship in addition to my Cassell scholarship. I was born into a working class family in Manchester with 6 brothers and sisters, I said. I went into engineering when I was 14, into the RAF at 18, and served in Egypt. "Tell me about Egypt," said Boaz. "I was guiding the Suez Canal for a year," I said, "but it was the chance of a lifetime." "What was?" asked Mr. Boaz. "To see Karnak and Luxor. I saved up all my money and leave and went to the Valley of the Kings. I told him how wonderful it all was and that it was the greatest possible experience. "You really must go, Mr. Boaz," I said. He threw back his head and laughed. "Mr. Smith," he said, "all my life I've wanted to go to Luxor, and all my life I've found excuses for not going. You had nothing, but you knew about Luxor and the Nile and the Valley of the Kings. And you found it all by yourself?" So the president got out of his chair and shook my hand. "I think you are a Magdalene man. Smith, welcome to the college. See Harry Weldon about your PPE and tell him you are a member of the college. Then see the Dean of Arts in the cloister. Fill in forms and all that." Harry Weldon was extremely friendly and we had a glass of sherry. I was beginning to drool at the thought of Magdalene. The very atmosphere made me tingle with joy. "I'm a socialist, but not a communist," I told Harry Weldon. I thought it as well to make that clear. Weldon chuckled. "Surprise me, Smith, surprise me," he said. After the censor had got to work, Weldon saw me again. "What's the old sod up to? Smithy, what have you done to him?" I told him I didn't want to go to St. Catherine's. "Quite right too," said Weldon. Who would want to go to the cat's home with the buck? Tell him to piss off. So I nearly upset. Now, this is just about his experience in, when he went to Oxford. So enough of that. Next time, I'm going to go to chapter 5. In chapter 5, that's when they started talking about Africa. Hello, Africa. I joined another union, the municipal and general workers, and became a Smithfield porter, a butter factory where I worked. So that's what we're going to go to next time. You have Hello, Africa. How he then became, how he came to Africa, then how he became a colonial officer, chapter 6. How he became a colonial officer, that's in there. That's Aros Smith, Department of Labor. So my 120 minutes is almost up. So I'll continue with it from here tomorrow. We'll do chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. So chapter 7 is the dark side of the colony. Yeah, that's how he became a colonist himself, working as a colonial officer. The necklace of diamond. So we might even get up to chapter 8 tomorrow. Let me see. Yeah, we may get to chapter 8 tomorrow. And that's going to be like about 80 pages. So today we have done 65 pages. So if you join me again tomorrow, right, we can, what do you call it? We can dig a bit further, same time from 2 p.m. So thank you so much, everyone. I am going to see you later this evening, of course. And yeah, our brunch time of reading is back. So if you have a chance of joining us tomorrow, that would be great. But make sure you join us later this evening for what is going on. Good afternoon.
Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó dòdòdò.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó dòdòdò.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Maiyegun ti dé o, ọ̀rẹ́ ará ìlú.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Lórí Facebook, lórí YouTube.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Gbogbo bó ṣe ń lọ ni Maiyegun já wa sí.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Àṣírí ọ̀jẹ̀lú kì í bò níbẹ̀ o.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Bó bá ṣe eré, àní Maiyegun máa wí.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Ó sì tún ṣe eré, wàá gbọ́ níbẹ̀ o.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Maiyegun diary, diary Politico.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Godfatherism kò sí lọ́rọ̀ Maiyegun.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Ẹ farabalẹ̀ sẹ́ o kẹgbọ́rọ̀ lẹ́nu o.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Àní Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ tó dòdòdò.
Maiyegun diary, Maiyegun number one.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Maiyegun ti dé. Ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Lórí Facebook.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Lórí YouTube.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Bọ́ bàbá gbé wúrẹ́.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Ijó ìgbádìyẹ.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Pẹ̀sìdó bá rúfin o.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Kí gómìnà kówó jẹ.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Ọlọ́pàá tí ń darí bá.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Aṣòfin tí ń rúfin o.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Òpùrọ́ olóṣèlú.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Maiyegun ti dé. Gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé. Gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe èyí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe, ọmọ bá dèrò ní fi wọ́n níran o.
Maiyegun ti dé. Gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé. Gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe èyí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe, ọmọ bá dèrò ní fi wọ́n níran.
Wọ́n fowó bẹ́ẹ̀ o, Maiyegun ó sọ pé wọ́n ò bẹ́ẹ̀. Wọ́n fowó bẹ́ẹ̀, Maiyegun ó sọ pé wọ́n ò bẹ́ẹ̀. Oníkan ṣáàtì ṣe èyí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe fáwọn ará ìlú tó gbé wọn débẹ̀ o.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì ṣùgbọ́n ní má ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dẹ́rọ̀ ò ní fi wọ́n níran.
kì máa yí ṣeré ọ̀rọ̀ yìí kì í ṣẹ̀fẹ̀ kì máa yí ṣeré ọ̀rọ̀ yìí kì í ṣẹ̀fẹ̀ ẹni bá ti lè lẹ́bọ̀ lẹ́rù o ọmọ bá dèrò kàṣàyè tú wọn síta.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì ṣùgbọ́n ní má ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dẹ́rọ̀ ò ní fi wọ́n níran.
tẹnitẹni ọmọ Maiyegun ọ̀rẹ́ ara ìlú mọ̀mọ́ ni mo fọlọ́hún sọ ẹ̀ bá kìlẹ́bù lóòótọ́ olódodo ìlú ọ̀tá ìlú mọ̀mọ́ ni ìwọ ṣá máa ń ṣọ́ra kò sì mọ́ bẹ̀rù bọ́tà ń lè rí bóníṣègùn lé káwọn mọ̀mọ́ fi ṣera wọn ni ó ti dẹ̀rùn tí wọn ò gbọ́dọ̀ sì mọ́ bẹ̀. èèpo ọ̀bọ lọmọ bá dérò tàjẹ́ ò gbọ́dọ̀ jẹ́ ó ti dọba lórí àbínú ẹni kò sì mọ́ bùyà àìsíwọ̀lú ní ẹnìkẹ́ ìgbódì ẹyin lábàrá o ó kó ẹni tó bá dán o àkàmù. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ túnra kì Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ túnra kì o ẹni bá ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dèrò òní fi wọ́n níran o.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì ṣùgbọ́n ní má ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dẹ́rọ̀ ò ní fi wọ́n níran.